There is a story that gets told in certain Italian-American families. An old man, someone's father, someone's grandfather, cried like a baby when the Italian line closed. Not because he lost his job, he didn't work for them. He cried because something magical had ended, and he knew that nothing would ever replace it. This story, or versions of it, surfaces again and again whenever people who remember these ships gather to talk. Different fathers, different cities, the same tears. And when survivors of the Michelangelo or the Raffaello describe their crossings, even now, decades later, they don't talk about fuel costs. They don't mention government subsidies. They talk about the midnight buffets, the way the lattice funnels glowed against the Atlantic sky, the taste of wine at lunch on the third day out, when the rhythm of the crossing had finally settled into their bodies. Here's what bothers me about how history has treated these ships. The story most people tell is the wrong one. You know the version. Two beautiful liners, built at exactly the wrong moment in history. The jets were coming, the accountants were screaming. By 1975, Italian taxpayers were subsidizing every passenger to the tune of 100 million lire per day, roughly $700 per person. Italian newspapers demanded explanations for what they called floating memorials of a bygone era. Yes, the economics were impossible, that much is true. But that's not the whole story. And frankly, the people who loved these ships are tired of that being the only story anyone tells. To understand what these ships actually meant, what they gave to the people who sailed them, you have to understand the company that built them and the nation that demanded they exist. Italian Line wasn't just a shipping company, it was an ambassador service that happened to float. The company emerged in 1932 from the merger of three venerable shipping concerns: Navigazione Generale Italiana of Genoa, Lloyd Sabaudo of Turin, and the Kosulich STN lines of Trieste. From its first days, the merged company, officially Italia di Navigazione SPA, understood something that purely commercial operators often missed. An Italian ship crossing the Atlantic carried more than passengers. It carried national identity. The architect Gio Ponti articulated this philosophy precisely. An Italian ship is a piece of Italy, and it must represent the highest and most prestigious aspects of Italian taste, culture, arts and crafts. That wasn't marketing language. That was a design philosophy that shaped every decision, from the bronze sculptures in the foyers to the particular weave of the tablecloths in tourist class. By the early 1960s, everyone at Italian Line knew the jet age had arrived. They weren't stupid. Pan Am was selling tickets to Rome for a fraction of what a cabin cost, and the flight took hours instead of days. The transatlantic passenger trade that had sustained generations of steamship companies was dying, and everyone in the industry could read the numbers. They built two more ocean liners anyway. The decision seems irrational from a purely financial perspective. But Italy in the early 1960s was experiencing its economic miracle, the miracolo economico that transformed the country from a war-devastated agricultural society into an industrial power. Between 1958 and 1963, Italian GDP grew at rates exceeding 7% annually. Fiat was producing cars for a newly motorized population. Olivetti typewriters sat on desks across Europe. Italian design, sleek, modern, sophisticated, became synonymous with post-war style. National pride demanded demonstration. Italy had rejoined the community of leading nations, and leading nations expressed themselves through grand projects. What better demonstration of Italian capabilities than two magnificent ships that would cross the Atlantic flying the tricolor, carrying Italian taste, Italian food, Italian art, Italian hospitality to the shores of America. The government didn't merely permit this ambition, It subsidized it from the beginning, viewing the ships as floating embassies as much as commercial enterprises. The investment was cultural as much as economic, a statement about what Italy had become and what it intended to remain. Not the fastest ships, not the largest, the most beautiful, the most civilized, the most thoroughly, unapologetically Italian vessels ever to cross the ocean. The contracts went to rival shipyards, and the rivalry mattered. The Ansaldo shipyards of Genoa received the commission for the Michelangelo. The CRDA yards of Trieste, Cantieri Riuniti dell'Adriatico, would build her sister, the Raffaello. Though designed as identical twins, the two cities approached the task with competitive pride that shaped every detail. Genoa was the older maritime power, home to Christopher Columbus, seat of a republic that had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries. Trieste had its own traditions, Habsburg elegance, Adriatic commerce, a different flavour of Italian identity shaped by its position at the edge of Central Europe. The competition between these yards reflected something deeper, the regional pride that has always animated Italian life, the sense that Genoa and Trieste each represented distinct visions of what Italian meant. The ships emerged with subtle differences that only experts would notice, but that both cities cared about intensely. The Raffaello was 0.7 metres longer than her Genoese sister, but she was also 0.9 metres narrower, displacing 22 tons more than the Michelangelo. The Triestine vessel could claim greater length, the Genoese vessel could claim sleeker proportions. Neither city would concede superiority. Both ships were powered by steam turbines, driving twin screws, a technology that was, by 1965, beginning to show its age. The maritime industry was transitioning toward diesel propulsion, which offered better fuel efficiency and lower operating costs. But steam turbines provided the smooth, vibration-free operation that luxury passengers expected, and Italian Line prioritized passenger comfort over operational economics. The engines could drive each ship at over 26 knots, though service speed was typically maintained at a more economical pace. The machinery spaces required substantial crew complements, engineers, oilers, firemen who maintained the complex systems that kept these vessels moving across thousands of miles of open ocean. The Michelangelo was delivered on April 21, 1965. She measured 45,911 gross registered tons, stretched 906 feet, 276 meters in length, with a beam of nearly 99 feet. Her hull was painted white with a green stripe, the colors of Italy, and when she moved through the water, she moved like something designed to be admired. She departed Genoa on her maiden voyage on May 12, 1965, under the command of Captain Mario Crepaz, with 1,495 passengers aboard, all of them pointed toward New York. The voyage took 7 days on what Italian Line called the sunny southern route, through the Mediterranean to Cannes, then Gibraltar, then the open Atlantic. The Raffaello had been launched on March 24, 1963, but her completion took 2 more years of fitting out. Her Mediterranean trial cruise finally came on July 10, 1965, carrying 1,200 passengers, including the President of the Italian Senate, Cesare Merzagora, whose wife Giuliana had served as the ship's godmother at the launching ceremony. The maiden voyage departed Genoa on July 25, 1965, with 1,121 passengers. Italy celebrated. The shipyards celebrated. The newspapers that would later demand the ship's retirement initially praised them as triumphs of Italian engineering and design. They had built floating palaces in an age when palaces had become unfashionable. and they didn't care that the age was ending. Before you ever set foot aboard, you saw the funnels. No ocean liner in history has ever looked like the Michelangelo and Raffaello. Those extraordinary lattice structures, geometric sculptures rising from the deck like nothing else afloat, remain the most distinctive visual signature in the entire history of passenger shipping. Period. Full stop. Nothing before or since has matched them. Professor Mortarino of Turin Polytechnic designed them to solve a practical problem that had plagued ocean liners since the advent of steam. Traditional funnels deposited soot and smoke onto passenger decks, particularly in following winds. Passengers in their finest clothes would find black specks on white linen. Deck chairs positioned too close to the stacks required constant cleaning. The lattice design, tested extensively in wind tunnels, dispersed exhaust more efficiently, directing it up and away from where elegantly dressed passengers took their afternoon constitutionals. The criss-cross lattice work, reminiscent of pre-World War II battleship mast construction, supported this function while creating something visually unprecedented in civilian ship design. Functional, yes, but also beautiful in ways that conventional funnels never managed. In daylight, the funnels appeared almost weightless. The geometric patterns created visual interest that shifted with the angle of the sun, the open structure allowing sky to show through where solid steel would have blocked the view. The effect was lighter, more modern, more artistic than the traditional smokestack. At dusk, as these ships steamed westward toward America or eastward toward home, the lattice caught the dying light in ways that conventional funnels never could. The open framework became a filter for sunset, transforming the ordinary end of day into something prismatic, something unique to these vessels. But at night they became something else entirely. Illuminated from within, those funnels glowed against the darkness like beacons in the vast emptiness of the open ocean. Passengers standing on the upper decks after midnight, perhaps returning from the late-night Lido buffet, would look up and see twin towers of light suspended between the stars above and the black water below. The North Atlantic at night, far from any shore, offers a darkness that most modern people never experience. Without light pollution from cities, the sky blazes with stars invisible in ordinary life. The Milky Way arcs overhead, clearly visible as it never is in the urban world these passengers had left behind. Against this backdrop of infinite darkness and infinite light, the lattice funnels glowed. They became the visual signature of an experience that shaped how entire families remembered the act of crossing an ocean. People remember those funnels the way they remember the faces of loved ones. Ask anyone who sailed on these ships to describe them, and the funnels come first. The Raffaello glimmered in the morning sun as if it were a white jewel. That's how one passenger described the boarding experience, writing years after the ship had vanished from the seas. The designers understood something crucial about the psychology of ocean travel. The transition from land to sea, from the ordinary world to this floating one, had to establish immediately that everything was about to be different. When passengers ascended the gangway and entered the ship, they encountered spaces designed by Italy's most celebrated architects. The approach differed between the two vessels, and this too reflected the competition between their building yards. The Michelangelo's interiors followed a more traditional elegance. Designers including Nino Zoncada, Pulitzer, Lucicenti and Monaco, architects who had shaped earlier Italian liners and understood the conventions passengers expected, created spaces that honored the past while embracing modern materials and techniques. The first-class ballroom, named Fiorenza after Florence, featured a center dome rising 2 decks high and extending the full width of the vessel. This was grandeur in the classic mode, updated but recognizable. The Raffaello received bolder treatment. Her interiors were entrusted to architects who brought deliberately fresh perspectives. Michele and Giancarlo Bussiri Vici, along with Attilio and Emilio Lapadula, Aldo Cervi, Vittorio Frandoli, and Umberto Nordio. Many of these designers had no previous naval experience, and this was intentional. Italian Line wanted the Triestine ship to feel different, more progressive, more daring. Her first-class foyer featured crisp white finishes, highlighting two bronze mermaids sculpted by Alessandra Bussiri Vici. A bas-relief by Francesco Coccia depicted the Renaissance painter Raffaello, for whom the ship was named. The first-class ballroom employed striking metallic modernism, with tubular glass chandeliers suspended from large metal beams, a look that could have felt cold, but somehow achieved warmth through the quality of its materials and the skill of its execution. Both ships incorporated artworks by Italy's most significant contemporary artists: Capogrossi, Ridolfi, Turcato, Spackle, Severini, Fiume, Mascherini, and Luzzati all contributed pieces that passengers encountered throughout their voyage. These weren't decorations. They were museum-quality works, commissioned specifically for these vessels, installed in spaces where passengers would live with them for 7 days at a time. Walking through these ships wasn't merely transit from cabin to dining room. It was an immersive gallery experience, art surrounding you at every turn. The statistics alone convey the scale of what these vessels offered. 30 lounges, a theatre seating 489, 3 nightclubs, 760 cabins, 18 elevators, a car garage accommodating more than 50 vehicles for passengers who wish to drive their own automobiles through Europe upon arrival, and 725 crew members serving 1,775 passengers at full capacity. That ratio, nearly 1 crew member for every 2.5 passengers, meant that no reasonable request went unanswered. The 3-class system aboard these ships wasn't merely about accommodations. It was about creating 3 distinct emotional experiences of the same transatlantic crossing, each complete in itself, each offering its own version of the Italian Line experience. First-class passengers inhabited the upper decks, their cabins and public spaces positioned where the ship's motion was gentlest and the views most commanding. The 535 passengers in this tier paid premium fares for premium treatment, and the ship delivered it relentlessly. The first-class dining room extended the full width of the hull, an enormous space that somehow maintained intimacy through careful design. On the Raffaello, the first-class restaurant featured organic, flowing ceiling forms reminiscent of a cave, creating the sense that you were dining in a space carved by nature and then perfected by human craft. On the Michelangelo, the approach was more traditional, but no less elegant. First class came with privileges scattered throughout the ship. 6 swimming pools served all passengers, but the first-class adult pool was heated by infrared lamps during cool weather, allowing swimming even on overcast North Atlantic days when the wind cut through lighter clothing. The Raffaello's pools possessed an ornamental, almost luxurious appearance, while the Michelangelo's pool was notably simpler, though its triangular Lido bar became a beloved gathering place. Between the 2 lattice funnels, first-class passengers found kennels for their pets, complete with a small courtyard for exercise. This arrangement was reminiscent of the legendary French liner Normandie. Italian Line understood that wealthy travellers often refused to be separated from their dogs. Cabin class, 550 passengers, occupied a comfortable middle position, both literally and figuratively. These passengers had access to elegant public spaces and genuinely comfortable cabins. They shared certain dining areas with first class, experiencing the grandeur of the ship's most impressive rooms while paying substantially less for their crossing. Cabin class represented excellent value, almost all the experience at a fraction of the price. And then there was tourist class. Here's what most people don't understand. Tourist class accommodations on the Michelangelo and Raffaello exceeded what first-class passengers had enjoyed on liners a generation earlier. The 690 passengers in this tier didn't occupy steerage, those dark, crowded spaces below the waterline that earlier generations of immigrants had endured. They occupied real cabins. They ate real food. They had access to real public rooms. The stairways were elegant. The lounges were designed, not merely furnished. One passenger who crossed in tourist class as a young person remembers exploring the ship, wandering into areas that weren't technically permitted, surprised by the engine room's accessibility, the curiosity of youth rewarded by a vessel that seemed to encourage exploration. The distinction between classes wasn't better versus worse. It was different worlds, different experiences, all of them genuine. A tourist-class passenger on these ships travelled better than most people travelled anywhere in the 1960s. A transatlantic crossing aboard the Michelangelo or Raffaello was not simply 7 days of elapsed time. It was an elaborate choreography of meals, activities, rest and celebration that gave structure to what could otherwise have been mere waiting. Dawn watchers found the decks nearly deserted in the early hours, the only sounds the ship's progress through water and perhaps the distant clatter of the galley preparing breakfast. Serious walkers appeared soon after, passengers who understood that the full circuit of the promenade deck, repeated multiple times, provided exercise sufficient to justify the excesses of the dining room. Breakfast offered choices reflecting different passenger styles. The dining rooms provided formal seated service with white tablecloths and menus printed fresh each day. Many passengers preferred the more casual buffet options, where one could eat quickly and proceed to the day's activities, or linger over coffee while watching the ocean slide endlessly past. Morning hours offered gentle entertainments. Deck games maintained their popularity. Shuffleboard, quoits, various ball games provided competition for the athletically inclined. The libraries offered quiet refuge for readers. The writing rooms, furnished with Italian line stationery embossed with the company's crest, allowed passengers to compose letters that would be posted upon arrival. There was something satisfying about writing "At Sea, North Atlantic" at the top of a letter. The swimming pools filled as the day warmed. The surrounding Lido decks transformed into social stages, where passengers saw and were seen, where reputations formed and romances kindled. Children ran between the pools while their parents reclined in deck chairs, the Atlantic breeze carrying away the day's heat. For children, these ships offered freedom unknown on land. An enclosed world where they could roam safely while their parents enjoyed cocktails. Luncheon was substantial. The Italians saw no reason to skimp at midday when the body needed fuel and the spirit needed pleasure. Many passengers found the hours immediately following perfect for napping. The ship's gentle motion, unless weather intervened, combined with the effects of wine and pasta to create an irresistible drowsiness that felt earned rather than lazy. Afternoons offered organized activities, bingo games with modest prizes, language lessons for those wishing to practice Italian or English, bridge tournaments for the serious players, lectures on topics of general interest. The ship's 489-seat theatre showed films, first-run pictures often, providing a curious hybrid experience. Watching American movies in the middle of the Atlantic, surrounded by Italian elegance, the screen flickering while the ship rolled gently beneath you. The cocktail hour began the evening's transformation. Passengers retired to their cabins to change. Dinner dress codes, strictly enforced in first class, required jackets and ties for men and appropriate elegance for women. The shift in atmosphere was palpable as the ship prepared for its nightly celebration. The bars filled with passengers enjoying aperitifs, conversations sharpening with anticipation of the meal to come. If there was one area where these ships exceeded even their own considerable ambitions, it was food. Multiple people who sailed decades ago, who remember little else from that era with precision, recall the meals with almost religious intensity. Italian line understood something fundamental about the relationship between eating and memory. Food is not merely sustenance, but experience made edible. What you eat becomes part of who you are. The menus changed daily, following a rhythm established by Italian line tradition over decades of transatlantic service. Each meal offered multiple courses, each course offered multiple choices, and all of it was prepared fresh by galleys staffed with skilled Italian cooks who viewed their work as craft, not labor. The galley operations required coordination worthy of a military campaign. Hundreds of meals served simultaneously across multiple dining rooms, each dish arriving at proper temperature, each plate presented according to Italian line standards. Gala dinners, special meals marking particular occasions during the crossing, including the captain's dinner that served as the voyage's social climax, elevated the experience further still. A gala dinner menu from an Italian line ship reads today like a document from a vanished civilization. Multiple courses building from light to heavy and back to light again, wines carefully selected to complement each progression, desserts that would require a dedicated afternoon if attempted in a home kitchen. The food was unapologetically Italian, which in the 1960s required more explanation than it does now. This was an era when Italian cuisine in America still meant spaghetti with meatballs and checkered tablecloths, the adapted cooking of immigrants who had made do with available ingredients. The sophisticated regional traditions of Italy, the delicacy of northern preparations, the robustness of southern cooking, the endless variations of pasta, shaped and sourced according to centuries of accumulated wisdom, remained largely unknown outside immigrant communities and expensive restaurants in a handful of major cities. Aboard these ships, passengers discovered what Italian food actually meant when prepared by Italians for Italians, with Italian ingredients loaded aboard in Genoa. They discovered that pasta came in dozens of shapes, each designed for specific sauces. They discovered olive oil used not as a substitute for butter, but as a primary cooking medium with its own character. They discovered that Italian wine wasn't just Chianti in straw-wrapped bottles, but an entire world of regional varieties. The midnight buffets became legendary. After dancing in the nightclubs or gambling in the ship's casino, passengers would discover spreads of almost impossible abundance. Elaborate displays arranged with the care of art installations awaited them. Carved meats, seafood presentations, cheese displays, pastries and fruits, and everything in between. These buffets were spectacles as much as meals, opportunities for the ship's galley to demonstrate capabilities without the constraints of table service. Even tourist class ate magnificently by the standards of shoreside restaurants. The food in lower classes was simpler, certainly, fewer courses, less elaborate presentation, but it was never cheap. Italian line's reputation depended on every passenger, regardless of fare paid, leaving the ship having eaten better than they did at home. Wine flowed throughout every meal, with a liberality that startled American passengers accustomed to wine as a special occasion indulgence. The Italians viewed wine differently, food's natural companion, as essential to a proper meal as bread and olive oil. Passengers who boarded with limited wine knowledge often disembarked with palates educated by a week of daily tastings. When dinner concluded, the ship transformed again. 3 nightclubs provided alternatives for passengers seeking different atmospheres. Some favoured intimate spaces for quiet conversation over drinks. Others wanted the energy of a room filled with dancing couples and the latest popular music. The ships carried orchestras and bands capable of playing everything from classical dinner music to the contemporary sounds of 1965. And as the years passed, those sounds evolved with the times. The 489-seat theatre offered evening film showings, but it was also used for shipboard performances, ranging from professional acts hired for the crossing to talented passengers showing off skills honed on shore. In 1970, the Raffaello's theatre was converted into an ice rink, a technological feat that required substantial engineering modification, where an American family performed skating shows for delighted audiences. This installation predated by decades Royal Caribbean's much publicized claim to have pioneered shipboard ice rinks. But for many who sailed, the most memorable evening activity was the simplest: walking the decks under the stars. The North Atlantic at night, far from any shore, offers a darkness that most modern people never experience. Without light pollution from cities, the sky blazes with stars invisible in ordinary life. The Milky Way arcs overhead, clearly visible as it never is in the urban world. Standing on the deck of an ocean liner in the middle of the night, surrounded by nothing but black water and infinite sky, passengers experience something approaching the sublime, a word that originally meant an overwhelming confrontation with nature's vastness. Against this backdrop, those lattice funnels glowed from their internal illumination, twin towers of light, the only vertical interruption between dark water and infinite sky. Both ships operated primarily on the sunny southern route between Genoa, Cannes, Gibraltar, and New York. This routing served the passenger base Italian line cultivated. Italian emigrating or visiting family in America, Italian Americans returning to the old country for weddings and funerals and summer visits, tourists who wanted to begin or end their European adventures in Italy itself, rather than the northern ports that British and French liners served. The southern route meant better weather, milder seas, and landfalls that stirred the imagination. Departing from Genoa meant passing through the heart of the Mediterranean, that sea which had cradled Western civilization. A stop at Cannes brought the glamour of the French Riviera aboard. Gibraltar, the ancient pillars of Hercules, beyond which classical sailors feared to venture, marked the transition from the enclosed sea to the open Atlantic, a symbolic threshold that every westward passenger crossed. In the early years, passenger loads remained healthy. Southern Europeans maintained what observers described as traditional sea-minded attitudes toward transatlantic travel, even as northern travellers increasingly chose aircraft. On April 12, 1966, the Atlantic reminded everyone that ocean liners remained subject to forces no engineer could control. The Michelangelo, 6 days out of New York, with 745 passengers, encountered a wave estimated at over 50 feet that smashed through her forward superstructure, killing 2 passengers and 3 crew members. She reached port safely, was repaired and returned to service, but the incident shadowed her reputation. The end came gradually, then suddenly. Throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s, passenger numbers declined as jet travel became increasingly affordable. By 1970, flying across the Atlantic cost roughly the same as sailing and took 8 hours instead of 7 days. The subsidies rose as passenger loads fell. By 1975, the government was providing 100 million lire per day to keep the ships running. The Michelangelo made her final transatlantic arrival in Genoa on July 12, 1975, carrying 1,202 passengers, likely a record for the 1970s, as travellers rushed to experience the ships before they disappeared. On the aft Lido deck that afternoon, many of the staff and crew gathered alongside guests. There were tears. Both ships were laid up in La Spezia, their futures uncertain, their magnificent public rooms empty and echoing. What happened next is a chapter most coverage of these ships ignores entirely, and it deserves far more attention than a footnote. In 1976, the Iranian government purchased both vessels. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was engaged in an ambitious modernization program for Iran, and the ships were intended to serve as floating barracks and accommodation vessels for military personnel at Bandar Abbas, a strategic port on the Persian Gulf where Iran was developing naval facilities. The Michelangelo and Raffaello crossed one final ocean, passed through the Suez Canal, and arrived at their new home. They were repainted in Iranian naval colours, their Italian line livery erased. The magnificent public rooms that had hosted gala dinners and midnight dances became mess halls and recreation spaces for Iranian sailors. The elegant cabins became barracks. The artwork, Capogrossi, Severini, Spacal, all those commissioned masterpieces remained aboard, now serving a military function their creators never imagined. The ships sat at anchor in the Persian Gulf heat, their air conditioning systems working overtime in temperatures that would have seemed impossible on the North Atlantic. The humidity, the salt air, the lack of regular maintenance that ocean liners require, all of it began to take its toll on vessels designed for very different service. But here's the detail that haunts me. Iranian children visited these ships for parties during what survivors remember as golden and happy days. Birthday celebrations in spaces that had once hosted Italian line galas. School groups exploring deck spaces that had seen movie stars and diplomats. The vessels that had carried Italian families across the Atlantic now created memories for a new generation of young people in a different ocean, under a different flag. The magic didn't entirely die. It transformed, shifted, found new expression in circumstances utterly unlike anything its creators anticipated. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 changed everything. The Shah fled. The new government had different priorities than maintaining former luxury liners as naval barracks. The ships remained at anchor, their condition deteriorating, their futures increasingly uncertain. Then came the war. The Raffaello met her end first. During the Iran-Iraq War, on October 24, 1983, Iraqi aircraft attacked Bandar Abbas. The Raffaello, lying at anchor, took damage during the raid. After years of deferred maintenance, after the revolutionary disruptions, after sitting in the Gulf's corrosive environment, the damage was deemed irreparable. The Triestine beauty that had carried the president of the Italian Senate on her trial cruise, whose godmother had been Giuliana Mezzagora, whose bronze mermaids had greeted first-class passengers in the foyer. She was broken up for scrap. The exact disposition of her remains, the fate of the art and furnishings that had made her distinctive, remains unclear. Scrapping operations in that era were not conducted with heritage preservation in mind. The Michelangelo lingered longer. Her hull deteriorated year by year, the elegant proportions that had made Genoa proud slowly succumbing to neglect. The Fiorenza ballroom, that two-deck masterpiece, fell silent. The lattice funnels that had glowed against two different skies, Atlantic and Gulf, rusted. By the late 1980s, she too was broken up for scrap. What happened to the art? The tubular glass chandeliers, the Bussiri Vici bronzes, the works by Mascarini and Luzzati. The ship's bells that had announced meals and departures. The Italian line china, the silver service, the 1,000 details that had made these vessels complete expressions of Italian taste, almost certainly lost. Occasionally rumours surface, a piece reportedly seen in a Tehran antique shop, a fixture supposedly salvaged by a naval officer, but nothing verified. The physical remnants of the Michelangelo and Raffaello have scattered into the same darkness that swallowed the ships themselves. What survives are memories, photographs, a few menus preserved by passengers who understood they were witnessing something that wouldn't come again, and stories passed down through families about what it felt like to cross an ocean aboard something beautiful. The Michelangelo and Raffaello failed the accountants. That much is undeniably true. They were born too late. The jets were already flying when their keels were laid. Every financial analysis showed that transatlantic passenger shipping was a dying industry, and building new ships for that industry was folly. The subsidies required to keep them operating would have been better spent on almost anything else. The Italian newspapers were right to question the expenditure. But accounting measures profit, not meaning. And these ships meant something. They meant something to the Italian families who crossed on them, connecting old world to new in the final years when such connections could still be made by sea. They meant something to the 725 crew members who spent years making the experience complete, who took pride in creating something beautiful rather than merely functional. They meant something to Italian national pride at a moment when Italy was reclaiming its place among the world's leading nations. They meant something to the children who explored their decks, Italian children in the 1960s, Iranian children in the 1970s, who discovered freedom in their corridors, who formed their understanding of what magnificence looked like. When people tell stories about fathers and grandfathers who cried when Italian line closed, and they do more often than you might expect, those tears weren't about a balance sheet. They were about the midnight buffets and the Lido deck at sunset, and the way those lattice funnels glowed against the Atlantic sky. They were about experiences so complete, so thoroughly magnificent, that decades later the memories still bring tears. That's not what failures create. That's not what forgettable things leave behind. The Michelangelo and Raffaello failed as businesses. They succeeded as experiences. And we've been telling the wrong story for far too long. Subscribe for more stories like this.